Are you struggling to nail your marketing attribution? In this video, I'm going to compare two tools, Google Analytics 4 and Amplitude. Look at the key features, how they report on attribution, and the general workflow for how you analyze this portion of your data. Whether you're a marketer or a business owner, product manager, you'll get the insights you need to drive the return on investment on your marketing dollars. Let's jump right in. Let's start with Google Analytics, the OG. When Google actually first bought Urchin Analytics, now 20 years ago, they took this concept of the UTMs, the Urchin Tracking Modules, I believe they are, and they popularized them and became the primary way in which digital marketing is tracked online. Today, of course, we talk about UTMs all the time, UTM source, UTM campaign. So naturally, over the years, Google Analytics has had pretty solid attribution reports, and for a long time, it was sort of the gold standard. Now, in 2025, there's actually many options for reporting attribution, but the same models that Google Analytics popularized, first touch, last touch, linear, time decay, are available in our tools. Nonetheless, we're going to start with Google Analytics 4, the latest version of GA, and see how they report on attribution out of the box. As always, let's jump to my screen here. Before we actually look at the reports, let's look at some of the settings you can use in your Google Analytics account. So if we go to the bottom left admin portion, you're going to end up in this page. There's a lot of settings here, but we actually only care about this one, the attribution settings. If we click into them, then we see that we have a default attribution model. It will default to data driven compared to last click or the Google Pay Channels last click. And then there's a couple options here, whether to attribute to all channels or just the Google Pay channels. You'll start to see right away that the Google Analytics attribution tends to be heavily tied to Google products like Google Ads, which may be good if you're in the world, but if you have other networks, as most companies do, you have Facebook ads or TikTok ads and all kinds of other channels, this may not be as helpful. Then you have a look back window. Typically you have a click through, and this is broken down by your acquisition key events. For example, first open, first visit, these are default Google Analytics 4 events, and perhaps any other key events you define. Let's actually go back and look at these key events. So in the key events, you can actually define what are the key conversions for your product. This is where you might add purchase events, trial started, subscription started, any kind of event that you're sending into Google Analytics for either custom, or of course you can take any of the default key events that Google Analytics offers, like the first open, first visit we saw earlier before. You can see here, you can actually mark it as a key event. So overall, pretty simple, right? And create an event here actually just means it looks up to whatever events you've been sending into Google Analytics 4, and you choose that. Now, the third thing we want to look here in the admin settings is actually the conversion groups. If we go here, the channel groups. So we have a default channel group. This is something that, again, Google Analytics has popularized for a very long time. And we can kind of see the definition of that. Basically, based on some kind of combination, you can have different logic. If this is paid social, paid organic, for example, right? Paid search matches that. Let's go here, right? We, of course, can create a new channel group, and you can start to have your own definitions of what this might mean. It can be that, or it can also be by the UTM medium, UTM source, campaign name, and of course, you can have different combinations here, different conditions, of course, multiple conditions that you may want to use. They're primarily based on the UTMs. It'd be nice to see something here like referring domains, which you sometimes see, but in a way, Google Analytics can give you some of that through the channel group. And so Google will kind of do this logic for you by default, say, hey, this is Google search, or this is organic search, or paid search. So you can build upon that with your own definition. So this does give you some flexibility. And again, all of this is already pre-built for you. When you're creating a channel group, you can just go in and add your own definitions on top of it. So that's quite handy. You're not building exactly from scratch. You can kind of leverage this initial logic that Google Analytics offers. So we started the advertising snapshot, which is kind of related to Google Ads. It's actually not where I want to start this part of the video. I actually want to jump straight into attribution paths. And in here, we can see the different combination of channels and how they're driving those key events. Remember, we saw that earlier. Down here, you can actually see how many key events you're selecting. In this case, this account has 10 key events, and we're using all 10 key events, but you can just use 1, 2, 3, 5, whatever you want. So we see how many key events were driven by those different channel combinations. If there was revenue data, we see that here. Maybe days to key event, and of course, touch points to key event. Now, I find this perhaps the most useful part in this report, where you can kind of see the different channel breakdown from the definition we saw earlier, from this conversion channel, so channel groupings. And we kind of see how they play different roles. It kind of starts to explain a little bit of first to mid to late last touch model, and kind of see that, organic search is playing a big role here in the late touch points, less so in the early touch points. Direct is playing more in the late, and so forth. You can kind of start to get a sense as to where your channels fall in. And again, the more you organize your channel groupings in a way that makes sense to you, the more useful something like this will be. Then we have attribution models, right? Again, we have that channel grouping we saw before. Whatever you create will be available here. And then we can start to see or compare attribution models. In this case, we're really only comparing a handful of options, last click versus data-driven. I find data-driven to be one of the best models so far, because it kind of takes a bunch of other things into account compared to just last touch. So if you have that option, you typically want to use it as one of your models. You may not use it for all your things, but it's a critical model nonetheless. And again, we kind of see the split of key events versus revenue. Very handy to be able to compare models and use it against our custom channel groupings. And lastly, we have this planning, kind of see the same breakdown of channels, the same key events, some other metrics if we were to have those. Again, I think this skews quite heavily to Google Ads if you have the data come in or if you're integrating with it. Otherwise, this data is okay. So I will consider those attribution paths and attribution models to be the most useful reports. But it's nice, right? You kind of get this data out of the box. You get some default channel groupings. As long as you're tagging things correctly with UTMs, this will be quite useful to begin with. You can see attribution data in a couple of places. For example, if you look at user acquisition, and here's the main reports. And if you don't see these reports, actually, you have to go to library, and you can then just enable them here. So you can actually enable collections, and it kind of shows the different folders you see here on my left side. So in user acquisition, we kind of see the same channels again, but we can actually break down here a little bit. We can look at a source medium combination, either by the first source medium or any other combinations here. We can kind of see other metrics like new users, engagement metrics, the event counts of what we're looking for. So this is just another way to look at the same attribution data. Again, for out of the box, for a free product, this is generally pretty good overall. You can kind of see a lot of good solid metrics. If you start to mix in mobile data, it's not as easy, but generally mobile attribution is kind of its own little whole different beast. And you will need to do that in a slightly different way. So let's look at Amplitude. How does Amplitude handle attribution? So let's start in Amplitude by looking at the channel grouping, one of the few settings you can enable. Otherwise, everything is actually quite customizable, but you don't have a central place for settings. Now, we're going to go here to the data icon here in the left-hand menu, then properties, then channels. And these are the channel groupings we saw last in Google Analytics. So if you click into one of them, you're going to see a bit of similar logic here. You have the different channels here. You can label them whatever you want, of course, right? You can call them anything that you desire. And then in the columns, you do the specific logic. So we're building this with UTM source. In this case, this will be last touch UTM source. Then we have refer and we have UTM medium, but we do have available a few things. For example, if we just type UTM medium, you see that we actually have initial UTM medium and last UTM medium. So we have a first touch and last touch. We can combine those, and we can actually keep adding columns here. So you can actually have multiple combinations. So you can have very detailed and granular logic here, where if initial UTM source is this and last touch UTM source is that, then do this, right? Then in here we have the actual values. So this, for example, are the actual values we're expecting under this column. And again, you can sort of type whatever you want. You can have the typical Amplitude logic where you can do contains or rejects and stuff like that. You can see here that we're combining things. These are, of course, and, they're not or. So it's this column and this one, but we can combine both of them to come up with paid search or paid social, display. Then down here, if you don't have any other more specific labels, you can do any, which are sort of like a catch-all, right? And we call those other ads. Then we have the organic versions, right? In this case, we're looking at the referring domain to catch sort of the organic search engines. You can see here, right? Then we have the organic social, same thing, sort of the LinkedIn, the Pinterest, and so on. And then we have any for any external referral, and then sort of direct for a catch-all for anything that doesn't have anything. Now, this is a little bit more work in the sense that Google Analytics gives you a bunch of that default channel group and you can build upon. but you get the benefit that I think is a little bit more customizable in the sense that you have more properties available. You can use all the UTMs you have available. You can use any property, any user property you have available in Amplitude to actually build this channel grouping, which I think makes it quite powerful. But also keep in mind, the more granular you are, the more difficult it may be to debug it. So this is the primary sort of channel group and setting we do in attribution before we build a report. So you build this once, or you may build multiple channel groupings that you saw in the list before. I had something just for organic socials, which I use in a couple other situations. But once you have this built, then we can go and actually start to do some attribution. Now, the best place to do attribution in Amplitude is actually to use the data table report out here. So we have our data table. We can start by adding some kind of conversion event. So in this case, for example, let's add maybe a trial started. And we can, of course, add multiple. So maybe let's do, all the new subscriptions. Again, this sort of depends on whatever data you have here in Amplitude. And then on the group by, we can select that channel grouping that we created. So here's that one, actually, the channel grouping we're looking at. So it does the breakdown, takes in all the channels that are available in the data. And this is the last 30 days. And then under each one, right now, we're actually just looking at unique users that were labeled to this one. This one actually is kind of interesting because this is a form of attribution, but it's not actually fully the attribution that Amplitude supports. We can actually go here into the options, and you can see there's an attribution button. So we click that. Then we select what kind of model we want for this. So by default, there's no attribution model that's being applied, even though there is grouping. So just based on sort of basic labeling, it does some grouping, but we do have the ability to add other models. Again, some are really recognizable, first touch, last touch. We have data-driven. We have a few other things like U-shape, J-shape. This sort of depends on the few other specific things on what metrics or events you select. But depending if you select the correct ones, then this, of course, will be available. Let's select data-driven, and we're going to apply it to all the columns. So we're going to apply it to the second column as well. We have our look-back window. Remember, we had that set in Google Analytics as well. Now we can select it here at the data table level, which means, of course, we can have different data table reports with different settings. We don't have to limit ourselves to just one look-back window. Again, quite handy. So we're going to apply this. And you can see the numbers change, right? Now there's more labels here on the left-hand side. The same numbers are available. This is the data-driven model. Of course, we can compare, right? We could go into perhaps data-driven versus the last touch. So perhaps it might also make sense to actually add the trial started. And then we might do a last touch here. Last touch. And let's say we remove this column. And this is perhaps more comparable to what we were seeing before, where we have the same conversions, but we break them out slightly differently dependent on the attribution model that we're using. So we can kind of get compared attribution models. Now, of course, all this data is real time. Data is from 2 minutes ago. It's not sampled. We can refresh it if needed. We can look at total events or session totals if we care about that. There's a couple other ways to sort of slice and dice this. But this is the heart of the attribution models in Amplitude. They can start to give you a sense of a little bit more advanced attribution model. I think first touch, last touch, even data-driven are good starting models. But once you want to get more into intermediate advanced models, I think some of those J-shape, U-shape models can be quite handy, just a little different ways of slicing it. Some of this data, of course, could be taken into other charts, and you kind of see that in a few other ways. For example, we have the same events here. Actually, we'll remove one, and we can actually break it out here by that channel grouping here before. Again, this is not attribution, but it does give us general trends for some of those grouping labels that we saw earlier before, and be able to explore this data in different ways, right? Funnels, segmentations, retention, anything else that you have available in Amplitude, and see how those numbers are changing over time. Now, one con of Amplitude is, of course, everything has to be ingested. Amplitude doesn't typically give you events out of the box, generally speaking. So you have to instrument every event in some shape or form. Of course, there's no cost data here, so you're not going to be able to see the same cost data you might have in Google Analytics. Even if Google Analytics primarily gives you Google Ads cost data, that may be a negative, so you might have to do your cost data analysis somewhere else. But I do think the flexibility you get here in terms of slice and dicing the data can be quite powerful and make up for some of those downsides. Now that you know how each tool stacks up, the next step is to dive deeper into one of them. I don't have an in-depth video on Google Analytics for attribution, but I do have one on Amplitude. This next video is actually going to show you how all the Amplitude attribution reports work, the little finer details around the channel groupings, the settings, and all the things you need to know to really make the attribution data give you the insights you need to grow your business and find the return on investment on your marketing dollars. Highly recommend you check it out. You can click here to watch. As always, my name is Ruben Ugarte. I'll see you in the next video.